Hello everyone and welcome to the third episode of Daddy Chats. Here with me today I have the fabulous and geniusly intelligent Bitesized History. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm Kelsey. I'm the creator of Bitesized Ancient History, and I'm really excited to be talking today. My first podcast with somebody, so good to not be alone in a room.
Yeah, though I get the feeling I've well, we was literally just talking about this off camera, but now and then again, the feeling I found mutual is weird. That first time, especially when you're editing back, because do you do the thing where you like leave notes to yourself in editing? Like, because I'll look in the camera and I'll be like Ryan in editing, add this bit in because this will be funny. I have like full blown.
Oh no, that's
you
a
don't
really
do that.
good idea though.
Yeah. If I sometimes I'll leave it just in the script, or sometimes I'll just look to camera and then I'll be like, add this in because I've just come up with this idea and I know I'll forget it. And then that leads to me in editing arguing with myself, and I'm like, why did you want to add that in? That's such a stupid idea.
No, what I do, I write out like rough bullet points, but then that means like I'll do it in sections, and I look back at myself in editing and like the sharp contrast between like, yay, I'm happy in filming, and then like suddenly finish a bit and you're like,
yeah.
I look like an insane person.
The
it's so weird.
One time I accidentally left the clip too long, and you can clearly see me. I'm doing all all my hand gestures that I'm doing, and I just go as I'm reading my notes. It's the most funny thing. But to be fair, I fully script. Like, I have to have exactly what I'm going to say, because I know if I don't, I will go on a 4-hour tangent. Like, that's especially like everyone asked me for video on Alexander the Great, and I'm like, the Pyrrhus of Epirus one was 2 parts. I spent that was almost over an hour long talking about a guy who did a quarter of the stuff Alexander did. You do not want the 12-part series that will come out of Alexander, and I don't have the time.
No, yeah. As soon as you start, it's so hard to stop, and there's just so much. And then it gets to a point where you're like, I don't know if anybody's actually going to care. Like, we've got a little bit too niche.
Yeah, it's like very recently. I said I was going to go on a tangent, and I already have. Very recently, I did a 3-part series. Yeah, did a 3-part series on Catherine the Great, and I spent a good 5-10 minutes talking about Nakaz, which was a book she wrote about how to write laws. I spent 5 minutes talking about this random, most boring piece of information. I was like, yeah, no, and that is in the 2nd part, and it's the least viewed of all 3 parts. And I was like, it's fair play, because it's fair play. But it's when you're interested in the subject, it's easy to do.
It so is, and to be honest though, like TikTok is so random, specifically with when you make a video of what anybody's going to find interesting or not, because half the time I do something and I record it, I'll be like, oh, that was a bit dull actually, and then it'll be the one that does really well, and it just makes no sense.
I think TikTok is harder to make content, because when I'm making content for YouTube, I'm making it for people who like my content and the way I do stuff. When it's for TikTok, because they send it out to everyone, not just your followers, and that's how they are. Like, I've had followers go, I haven't seen you for ages. It's because they haven't been sent my stuff, because it just goes out. And then some random person will come in and be like, oh, you're just an oversimplified knockoff. And I'm like, where did you come from? Where's what? And it, like,
asked you to be here to judge me.
Yeah. Oh yeah. TikTok is the worst for hate comments. Like, I've seen in your comment section occasionally people will like just start coming through, and I'm like, I don't. This video is about like just a fun history fact. I'm surprised you haven't had the ancient aliens lot come after you yet, because they've come after me a couple of times. Because I've done videos taking mickey about how I used to be part of that little cult, and they go, oh, you shouldn't, you've been brainwashed by the mainstream media, and I'm like, the mainstream media made that documentary. Like, but I'm surprised that they've not, because you've debunked them harder than I have.
It
so
will
I just
be
take
when you just... But it's a fun thing to debunk, though, isn't it? Like, there's just so much to say.
Oh, yeah, no, it's easy, yeah. They do make it convincing.
Honestly, I'm like, come at me if you want. I'm bored, I've got nothing else to do. I'm happy to take you on.
I mean, I think the way, because it's on History Channel as well, it gives it that official push. Like, it is an interesting topic.
History Channel, like, post 10 p.m. when it gets like, very weird vibes.
Yeah, History Channel post 10 p.m. just after they've done the Nazi documentaries, because you get the normal, not the nice. That's a very poor choice of words. That's a very the interesting documentary. There we go. About, and then it'll actually be going in depth, and then and then it goes past that watershed, and it's like and here's how they worked with the aliens. And I was like, what?
It's just so
what?
bad.
I like the fact...
What annoys me the most is when somebody like obviously I don't know everything, but if I'm talking about a topic where I'm very much like, I studied this for many years, like I know what I'm saying, and then you'll get somebody who just has not done anything, like come in and be like, well, actually it's this, and you're like, tell me from where? Why are you doing this? And they're just so confident. Like, I don't know how people have the confidence sometimes. Like, it's bizarre.
That's like the guy that has been doing that useless degrees series on TikTok. Like, every single time he does one, I think he does it now because he knows he's going to blow up because people will call him out.
Yeah.
Like, the Egyptology one he did, and I've seen at least 50 different videos of people being like, well, here's how much money I make, here's my dream job I've got. And I'm like, it's almost like people study the place they want to work in.
Yeah, it was like, who was the woman who said Rome didn't exist? I feel like
Mum
got
Lennial.
to a stage where she just kept...
She followed me for ages.
Yeah.
After I did that...
out to Mum Lennial.
Yeah, everyone has mugged off Mum Lennial. Like, for ages, because I freaked out, because I thought I had her blocked. And then I was talking to Aidan Mattis, and then he was joking about like how she probably stalks her videos, and I was like, no, she doesn't. And then I was like, she follows me. And then I'm the only one she followed. And then what freaked me out was because I did that massive joke hit piece on her. That's how I met most everyone, because I just tagged the entirety of History Talk on that. And that was so poorly edited as well. And then I was like, when did she follow me? Was it that? And then randomly her account disappeared, and I assumed she'd blocked me. And then I realised she'd actually been taken down because we all know she was spreading that certain conspiracy theory that was... Yeah, I'm obviously the only political thing I do is go about is a free speech guy, but when you're spreading certain conspiracy theories that are also being spread by certain parties in WW2, maybe you shouldn't be on the platform.
No, it's just there's a fun conspiracy, and then there's the ones that are harmful to people's like education and knowledge. Yeah, where you're like, I can't. Yeah, like that's a whole section of history. You've just tried to go, no, that didn't exist. Like.
Oh yeah, that was in the when I did the had Aidan on, we debated Atlantis, and I was so sure I was going to win that one. And he's not like a fanatical one, but he does believe that you could have Atlantis in some form. He doesn't believe it's like flying saucers and that. Okay. And annoyingly, that is the segment of the podcast we lost. He does prove his point, but the thing that I'm semi glad that it got lost, because he was sitting there smiling and I was debunking, and I was like, well, no, because in the UK, obviously, have you ever been to Land's End? There's a big...
I'm from Cornwall.
Oh, really? Oh, that's so cool. When, like, I remember being there, and all the locals were, like, telling me about how Camelot was sunk beneath the waves at the edge. And I was like, well, if that's a myth here, then how come there's all these myths across the world, these places sinking, and not just Atlantis? And he just leaned back and smiled, and I was like... I've just gone straight into the world flood, haven't I? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, fair play. I'm not saying you're right, but I'm admitting that I fell into your trap and I have just proven your point. But it's
accidentally disproving your point.
Yeah. It's stuff like that. That's fun. That's not hurting anyone. But then when you get onto ancient aliens, like I was like that deep in it, and I was like, the lizard people controlled the British Empire sort of thing. And that is quite harmful because it alters the perception of history. Like when you're like, because the one thing I will ask is, it's always confused me, if obviously aliens didn't bring down giant massive space cranes and build the pyramids, so how did building the pyramids actually work with the technology available to them at the time? See, I knew I'd get back on track from the tangent.
We've made our way back.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. So it's one of those ones that we can't give a precise answer, but we have a very good idea now.
Yeah.
And part of it is that where the River Nile now lies is not where it would have been way back in the day. It obviously naturally rivers will like move and flow.
Yeah.
So they were much closer originally to the pyramids, also to do with the Aswan Dam and the whole building of that.
Yeah.
So it meant that we could kind of bring boats right up to the pyramids.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so we're not having to bring them all the way just across on sand. So that makes it a lot easier. And then we've also now found remains of the kind of ramps and the pulley system that they would have been using. So we're pretty sure of the way they were doing it. Obviously, manpower, it's still an amazing feat, but it makes a lot more sense than aliens. I think it's a valid answer that we don't need the aliens answer anymore.
Yeah, I think the best one, because I've seen, even now, I'll still go back and watch them, because it's good to watch stuff from, even though I know it's wrong, it's good to watch it from that point of view, because then I can analyse, and if it doesn't make sense to me, I'm like, I need to go away and look that up until it does make sense, because otherwise I'll fall into these traps.
No, you're right. It's a really useful way of looking at it.
Yeah. It's like the best one, because there's this particular series of tombs, I can't remember the name of it, and they was like, how did they get these massive like lumps of rock inside the pyramid? And so the ancient astronaut, the ancient aliens crew were like, oh yeah, they used the magnets, and like electromagnet, and I know you're gonna recognise exactly what piece of evidence they used for this, because it's the one that every ancient Egypt conspiracy theory uses. You know, the hieroglyph with the light bulb sort of image on, and that was how, and then the figure was sort of semi holding what looked like a modern day magnet, and that was the evidence that they used for this magnet system, which was hilarious.
It's so funny, and because like as well, like hieroglyphs, there are a lot of weird looking ones where you're a bit like, well, what is that actually showing? So it's just such a weird way to go in with our modern perspective and go like, well, it kind of looks like this modern day object. Yeah. I think the only answer then has to be aliens.
It's because, well,
naturally,
like the human brain is a predator's brain, so we're designed to seek patterns so that we can, you know, and we're, as well at the same time, earlier in our evolutionary tree we were being hunted all the time, so we will naturally see patterns. But I'm not gonna see the pattern of something from ancient Egypt. I'm gonna see a modern day pattern that I recognise, and that it's putting that modern day influence over ancient stuff. Like there's in Central America, South America, sorry. There is an Incan temple, and on the wall there is very, very clearly what looks like velociraptors, and people riding them, right?
Yeah,
and then everyone,
I think I've seen it.
Yeah, but everyone was immediately like, oh, it's like, so Dinotopia was a real thing, like dinosaurs, and I was like, it is possible that there was a species of animal that existed then. It's very unlikely that it was velociraptors, because that's our modern view of Jurassic Park and things like Dinotopia, which was massive when I was younger. And there's a scary number of people that listening to this that won't have a clue because they weren't born when it was on. But looking back, that could have just been their story. Like they could they've just been writing a story, like having a laugh. And I think it's because we're looking for a modern lens of everything they write as literal. Like we take, ironically, we're like Neanderthals. We take everything that's historical in a literal sense, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting point with the looking for patterns and stuff as well, because it's definitely something during my master's we were using as like an approach to study from a like sociology, psychology perspective, to try and understand ancient societies a little bit better, both detaching ourselves and trying to see it from their point of view by looking at it in the way that they were living as best as we can, obviously with the limited evidence. So like there's something, it was one thing that I used in my dissertation, it was called like the hermeneutic circle, which is like this circle of interpretation. So like the way you interpret it is like dictated by your environment. And both the environment is also dictated by like your interpretation of it and like what's happening each day. And like what we can actually then say for certain when we're looking at ancient societies, because there's only so much you can detach from how you're going to view it when you're not aware of all of the ways that you're viewing things, because it's such like a subconscious level. And it's so weird. But then like, so looking for patterns and stuff is also the way that they would have use just like their own society, which is like a universal thing, which is quite cool. So we use, so for example, with the creation of their gods and stuff, it's because they were looking for patterns in nature, and they're looking for human faces and human features in nature to kind of almost normalize it and harness what would have been a threatening or evil power into a recognizable human-esque god.
Yes. And
it's a very interesting way of studying it and looking at it from like, sociology and psychology.
I think it's interesting that that humans have always had a very sort of human-centric view of the world. And unless you're looking at sort of Native American cultures, they're the only cultures in the world like I've really seen that have more of a nature perspective. Whereas a lot of cultures always go down that route of not human superiority over nature, but I think it's a natural thing. We're seeing the world through as human beings, so we're going to have that human-centric perspective. And I think it's a unique thing that nearly every single culture has, and it is an interesting piece of psychology that's gone throughout history. It hasn't really changed. We're still very human-centric, i.e. with global warming and stuff, because it's not directly affecting us, so it's not going to immediately. But if we was polar bears or bees, we'd be panicked to high heaven right now. But it's
unfortunately,
yeah, it's an interesting. But I mean, obviously that's not always good, but it does have fun side effects. Like there was recently discovered on Hadrian's Wall. They was digging back, and they found a phallic symbol that a Roman centurion clearly on his lunch break had just drawn, and that it's stuff like that makes me, because it's our humour hasn't changed.
Yeah, it's a consistent. Phallic symbols will always appear on every piece of public graffiti.
You can tell that whoever it was that doodled that found it absolutely hilarious, and the fact that we can look at it and we get the joke. That without words, we don't speak the same language. There was massive cultural barriers. Like if I was to go back, I wouldn't be able to understand him or her. Who we don't know who drew it, and then they just pointed to that, and I'd laugh, and then there'd be a complete understanding of humour. And I think that is obviously we've got negative sides that we've carried throughout the ages, but the fact that there is that sort of unity in humour, I think humour links to human consciousness.
I was going to say, it's a really interesting point with the humour side of things, because obviously to link to ancient Greece, which I know is definitely more like your side of things, is when I was doing my undergraduate, I got very much into Greek theatre. And one part of this was I directed Aristophanes' Frogs. And it's so weird, because you'd think that a play written that long ago as a comedy would be so separated from modern society and what we might find funny. And it just isn't. It's still the exact same kind of slapstick, almost like the bodily humour of things. So you get the typical fart jokes or the way people smell, and it's just one of the things that have just never died out. And it's so weirdly refreshing when you see it in an ancient context and you're like, we're still making the exact same comedy for everybody.
I've noticed that it's giving us a meeting timeout key. I thought it gave us infinite time on that.
Let's have a think.
That's right. This is the bit that's edited. If this is still in the podcast, Ryan, in editing, you've messed up. This is the one time you're going to have to do some editing and actually cut this out.
If it does end, we can always just restart it.
Yeah, we'll just reboot. Maybe it's because we switch up. Yeah, normally it's unlimited for two people.
It's very weird, and it might extend us, because I know if it's not peak time, they tend to just be like, "Oh, carry on."
Yeah, if you're seeing this in the podcast, I've kept it in because it's kept going, and I just wanted to tangent.
Yeah,
if you're not seeing this, if you're not seeing this in the podcast, it means that I did have to edit out because it stopped midway through, and obviously I want the footage to sync up.
It happens.
Yeah. I've completely forgotten where we were. That was it. Humour and how the slapstick's gone with it. I think
humour. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the ancient Greek plays are. Because, the original plays, I remember the first one, because I've read a couple, I haven't read a lot, I will admit, but I've read a couple, and the first one is literally just a guy walks out on the stage, and then he's just chats for a couple of hours, and then, some of them were just people just talking to each other and making those sort of jokes for, 4 or 5 hours, and I was like, how much free time did they have that they could just rock up for 4 or 5 hours? And then, I think a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this, Assassin's Creed Odyssey actually does a very good job of representing ancient Greek plays, because it is when they walk out and they have to say these eloquent pieces, it's these, obviously it's translated to English, but these eloquent long lines that then out of nowhere have a fart joke at the end, and it's that sort of humour that the ancient Greeks really possess, because I think it's that sort of sarcasm wasn't really around at that point in history, but that sort of dry
humour. It kind
humour.
of is, though. Like, depending, obviously, it's your interpretation of the text, but it very much is, because so many of the comedies are very politically driven as well.
Yeah.
And they can, loads of them, we have where they're directly targeting a member of, like, a politician in the audience, witnessing it.
Yeah.
Like, they're right in front of them, making fun of them, and it's fantastic.
That's one of the things that I love about ancient Greece, because ancient Greece, like, they had a system where the super wealthy would, like, because it was obviously based on honour, that the super wealthy had to work together and they would be assigned a job role. So if you didn't pay your way, so to speak, and you didn't do your charitable work, you lost honour. And the way that they would get out of it was they would deliberately lose money in like gambling, and they'd be like, oh, I'm not that rich now, I can't do this service, I guess I'll have to do the cheaper one. And then obviously everyone would be like, oh, okay, fine. And then they'd watch their fight, and then the second they earned enough money, it'd be like, right, straight back to the proper job for you. And it's that sort of not sleazy attitude, just clever attitude, because obviously places like, because that was key in Athens, and anyone who knows me knows I'm definitely more of a Sparta fanboy than I am Athens.
Same.
Sparta's just more interesting. I mean, obviously,
it really is.
yeah. I mean, Sparta is an interesting place, whereas Athens was like good for like not societal equality, but
no.
No, definitely not. But making people pay their way when they got to that sort of stage, but also allowing that to flourish, like you were allowed to just markets. Sparta had a bit more control on its society, but obviously, like, the role of women was very different in Sparta. Like, you were seen as not as an equal, but someone who could hold their own. And then obviously on the counter side to that, whereas Athens obviously had the pay-your-way system, but obviously was quite corrupt and there wasn't societal equality, the Spartans had helots. And that's the thing I always have to bring up when everyone's going, oh, Sparta was like ahead of its time, it was so, like, it was all equal, and then I'm like, you do know helots were a thing. Like, the bulk of the Spartan army wasn't the elite fighting force, because that's propaganda. The Spartans were very good at propaganda. They weren't fighting idiots, they were geniuses. And that propaganda went through history past the existence of Sparta. So everyone believes Sparta was just a giant military force of, like, pure muscle, which is what they wanted you to believe, because it was scary. It's one of the reasons that Alexander was like, I can't be arsed. Like, he did leave them alone. It's not like, because he wanted to conquer Sparta, but he just, I mean, I think he eventually would have, eventually if he had more time. But one of the reasons he just sort of carried on with Persia is because he wasn't scared of them, but he just knew it would be too much hassle because of the propaganda.
No, I think that's such a good point. I've never thought about the propaganda aspect of Sparta, but you're right. And it is a testament to their ability to create propaganda that, to this day, people will sit there and be like, well, Athens was for the smart politicians, Sparta was just the military.
Yeah. I mean,
no, it's very bizarre.
Okay. I think my favourite bit is, obviously, you know, the myth of the 300, when it was actually, Leonidas actually had 7,000 men there, and that, to me, is because, like, so genius in the fact that the Spartans media was like, because there was only around 300 Spartans by the end of it. But there was also another 1,000 men in that final stack, because he sent most of the army home. And I'm like, the genius of that, to be like, there was a few other people there, but there was 300, and really
we're just going to focus on this bit, like,
and as you
I'm just going to, like, not quite tell the truth, and it doesn't matter.
Because they're technically not lying. They're just...
No, exactly.
Accentuating how much... Because obviously, with ancient historians, they like to tell a story. And, like, the stuff... I hope that the arrows that blot out the sun has some truth to it. Because that sounds so cool. But I know that there's no logistical way that that's possible.
You know what I did? So I did some research on this, actually, for one of my videos where I reviewed the movie 300.
Yeah.
And so while probably within history it wasn't quite as poetic as the blocking out the sun, it is because the actual historian kind of a little bit later than it, 200 years later, but still relative within ancient Greece, describes it in that exact way. So it shows they did a little bit of research to, like, what the accounts were at the time. Yeah. Which is quite cool.
they did a lot more research, like, obviously the father of history, Herodotus, who I really overpronounce his name now because I got it wrong once and I'm always scared of getting it wrong again. Like, he did research. He travelled to these places. It was like one of the things that he was known for, is he liked to travel. But he did also embellish, like, when I was researching Tomyris, like, and her battle against Cyrus the Great, who, she is the accepted source of how Cyrus the Great died. I've got a video on it, but I'll briefly go over it to set the scene. Because Cyrus the Great wanted to marry her, mainly because he knew that when she died, he would inherit her lands. And she was like, I'm not really about that. I want them to go to my son. So she said, I'll either go, you retreat 3 miles and I'll go into your lands, or I'll retreat 3 miles and you come into mine, and we'll see who wins, right? He decided, and then all of his advisors were like, you can't retreat to a woman. That's weak. You can't rule. No, you can't do that, Cyrus. And so he told her to retreat. Then he sent a small Persian force instead, which her son attacked, won, and then they found all the Persian wine, which they weren't used to. So they all got drunk, and then he slaughtered the army, and then he captured her son. He then, obviously, because her son was dishonoured, he then went like into what we would now see as depression, and he sadly took his own life. Tomyris wasn't happy with this, and so she told Cyrus to come and meet her, and he will have his fill of blood. By the end of the battle, he was decapitated, and she took a bag of blood that she'd strained, stuck his head inside it, and then went, there is your fill of blood. And that was all recounted by Herodotus. Yeah. But the thing that makes that story funny is, bearing in mind Cyrus the Great was an empire builder, and Tomyris, was quite a cultured queen. The fact that she's bringing all of these tribes together, like in any other scenario, and then later historians would bring her up as like this cultured queen. Herodotus wrote it as the greatest battle between 2 barbarians. I love Herodotus. I've been compared to him a couple of times because obviously history daddy, father of history. It's an easy, it's, and I'm not gonna lie. If people want to make that comparison, I'm not gonna say no.
It's all right. No, Herodotus is a funny one to think about because he's obviously like one of our main sources for that period of time. So like, regardless of how you feel about him, you kind of have to accept it and use him. But also like, he's very questionable. Just aside from bias, I think he was good at his research, but it's not like, so you know how like if you get a source today, like you almost check the source with other people and compare. Whereas I think I get the vibe he very much just asked one person and went, yeah, that seems like, I'll take that as gospel. For example, with, I can't remember what book it is in, but with the gold digging ants of India. And you're just like, I don't even know how you got to this conclusion. And he's just gone, yeah, obviously he hasn't seen it for himself because we very much know that's not a thing.
But someone's just gone, oh, I saw it. And he's gone, yeah, fair play, we're mates, Yeah,
he's gone like, something's got lost in translation and also just wrongly, like, we've just gone, okay, I can understand that.
That's why there was a Greek playwright who really, it's known as the first science fiction book. I can't remember his name. Basically, the story that he wrote, it was meant to be entirely fictitious, and he was taking a mick out of the fact of people like Herodotus and stuff, who were always saying, this happened, and I went here, and I know this person went here, so this happened. And so his story starts off where they're on a ship, and then the ship goes into space, and they go to, like, Mars, and there's a war between Mars and Venus, which, and it's really this really epic thing. And then he goes through the whole book, and then he goes, and I'll tell you the rest of the adventure in the sequel, and he never wrote a sequel. The guy was, like, trolling before trolling was like a thing. If you did like
that's amazing.
And I wish I had actually researched so I could remember his name, but I'm not going to do it now because I'll take far too long to do it. But it's that sort of thing of like the ancient Greeks, and I say this as an ancient Greek fanboy, and I'm going to get a lot of heat for this, but they did just like to embellish. The same as the Romans. The Romans running around going, oh, the pits were brightly coloured painted people. Yes, in the middle of the Scottish Highlands, that is where all the naked people lived. Yes. Like, that's sounds
about right, yeah.
But I think obviously now the issue we have now is obviously modern historians have to look back and they're like, okay, was there 1 million men on each side of this army? Probably not. And then then like I feel sorry for you guys because the Egyptians did it as well. It was always that like they loved the number 1,000,000 or 500,000. That was their favourite one.
Yeah, specifically, ancient Egypt's really bad for it, where they will just repeat the numbers. And specifically with battle accounts, is that part of almost like a rite of passage for a new pharaoh was to claim victory in a battle.
Yeah.
But 50% of them never even went to war. They were using a previous battle. But we just have to kind of guess and hope for the best whether they actually did or not. And we'll see it like on the temple depictions and so on. And half of them, you're like, well, you didn't actually. That is just, you didn't go to war at all during your reign. You've just taken it from a previous battle. But obviously, we say it for certain, but we can never know. They might have.
Yeah, it's one of those things I always say to people, like, because I get asked for Bronze Age content more and more, because I've done a few bits, and I'm like, my knowledge of Bronze Age, like history is Assyria, a little bit of Hittites, and a very, like, I know about a little bit about one of the Ramses. I think it's Ramses II and his war with the Hittites. There was a particular battle that, I've done a video on it on TikTok, where they went through the encampment. The Hittites had a scouting force and they caught up with his reinforcements, and then they took those reinforcements out, and then they went to Ramses' camp, and then it ended up in like this weird stalemate because they fought inside the camp. And that's it. That's where my knowledge of ancient Egypt ends. That, and at one point one of the pharaohs went a bit crazy and wanted the sun god stuff, which is interesting because
That's a fun period, though.
So what actually happened with that? Because wasn't there a lot of human sacrifice that went on? That was kind of why everyone was like, we're not up for that. Or is that just a Hollywood embellishment?
I think you're talking about the Amarna period with the sun god stuff.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so this is Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and then it's ended by Tutankhamun's kind of period.
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, it's the most interesting period to study because it is like no other ancient Egyptian history, down to the T. So like even the artistic style completely changes to reflect his new outlook on Egyptian religion. Because basically, as I'm sure you know, prior to that and after, it was a kind of polytheistic religion. We have multiple gods. Whereas during the Amarna period, all we have is the one god, which is the Aten, which is like the sun disk. And we basically think now is that he created it himself because in this new religion, you could only communicate with the Aten through the pharaoh. So he gets a lot more power through it. Whereas with the other gods, you can have your own sort of private religion. You had to get to the Aten through the pharaoh. So he becomes the number one man. But obviously, people weren't very happy with it. He also moves the new capital over to Amarna and founds it on a completely new land. And by this point, ancient Egypt has been around for a very, very long time. So there's not many new lands. So the land that he chooses isn't very useful to live off. They have to like build certain supplies to survive. But in the long run, it's such a drain. Like it's just impossible to really maintain it.
Yeah.
And then you're making all of your government completely relocate with you under this new scheme where suddenly all your priests, it's like, well, we don't really have the same level of power anymore because you're the one that's in charge of it. So yeah, it didn't go down very well, but it is cool to look at because the art, he basically creates this new artistic style to reflect this new religion. So that's where you get the pictures of them where they have very like curved, almost alien-like bodies, which obviously feeds back into our earlier discussion.
Yeah, whenever I see those pictures, I know that there's going to be a comment underneath that goes, "It looks like an astronaut suit." And I'm like, yes, a modern astronaut suit. And like, I always say this: if ancient Egypt did have this hyper futuristic technology, it wouldn't look as we expect it to be. It's the same. There was a thought project a few years ago, because I used to be really into I'm starting to do dinosaur stuff again because it's really interesting. And you know, every kid loves dinosaurs. You know, I was obsessed with T-Rex velociraptors, but there was this thought project of a dino sapien, right? And they made it really, really humanoid. And to this day, bearing in mind, fake creature, there are paleontologists who will argue that it's too human. It goes back to human centrism. That it's too human centric. Like it had 3 fingers, but it was bipedal and it had these massive bird-like eyes. but it is really human. I thought if there was to be an intelligence from, you know, that period like of prehistory, it's not going to look humanoid. It's going to look reptilian. It's going to have the, you know, the arms retracted in and feathers and all that. And it's implying our bias, our modern bias. And I think that is the best, even though it's nothing to do with ancient aliens, it's the best argument against it, because all you've got to take is the fact that we assume if there was an intelligent dinosaur, it would look like us. It wouldn't have the long snout, which, you know, that's like saying if in 100 million years after humans have gone extinct, crocodiles took over. They're not going to become humanoid. They're gonna, you know, they're going to have crocodilian features. So the big question is, obviously everyone talks about Tutankhamun. Like everyone I know who's ever got mildly into Egypt. Was Tutankhamun, because I've heard that he's not actually that important. He was just sort of there as a pharaoh, but it was his discovery that made him famous to us. Is that true? Is it like, or was he actually a big deal?
I think generally on the basis of just what he achieved as a pharaoh, he didn't really do a lot. It's very much that he was one of the few tombs that we found where it hadn't been touched as much by others as grave robbers. So as you know, in the first kind of room that we get into, it had been completely ransacked.
Yeah.
But we find this kind of hidden side room where we have all of the treasures that we see of Tutankhamun today. And I think it's purely because we have so much to look at just from his tomb that he's become famous. With the addition of, obviously, Tutankhamun's curse, where the media obviously can have an absolute field day, and then later on we get so many films and books inspired by this idea of an Egyptian curse. And I think it's probably based off that, yeah.
So has Tutankhamun's curse actually killed anyone, or is it just media hype?
So people on the dig did die, but at different points, and we kind of know why each of them died. It's very normal human illnesses of the time. And yet some of the deaths that are being like associated with it are years later after the burial, and it's just like, well, it's normal for a human to eventually die. Especially during that era, they're not living as long as we did, and they're all having many health effects that we don't battle with today. But there are kind of what people would call curses. There are some in tombs, but it's not so much, oh my God, if you find this burial, you're going to be cursed if you open it. It's more to protect the deceased and just prevent people getting in, and that's really it. It's not in our Hollywood way, which makes me really sad because it would make it very exciting.
Some of my favourite films were The Mummy and The Mummy 2. Mummy 3 is a bit out there. We don't talk about The Mummy 3. When I was little, I bought that as a present for my mum when I was little, because my mum got me into The Mummy, ironically. And we bought it, and we was all sitting there watching it. It was a big family thing. We had like little table out, and it was a big birthday, and we was all watching it. And I remember watching it, and I was like, I really don't want to say that this is really boring, because this was my mum's birthday present. And my mum just went, "Why did you get me that for my birthday?" And I was like, "Oh, okay. This was a room thing?" But no, The Mummy 1 and The Mummy 2 are, you know, the Scorpion King's a bit. Again,
we don't need to talk about the Scorpion King.
The Scorpion King's good when you're 5 and you just want to see some random like violence, but not when. I mean, I watched it at the legal age. I watched it when I was 12, as the rating says. I wasn't a naughty kid who stayed up past his bedtime. Any FBI who are watching this, for whatever, I don't know why the FBI is watching this. Like an hour in at this point.
Know. We're talking about aliens.
Yeah, that's true. But The Mummy 1, they did actually do a fair bit. I believe you've done a video on The Mummy 1.
Yeah, The Mummy. I've done a video on Mummy 1. I still need to do the second one, because honestly, the Mummy films, like, I feel like without them, I probably wouldn't have studied Egyptology. Like, it sounds really bad that a film can like encourage you that much. But obviously, like, it's just fun, and it gets you into it, even if it's accurate or not. It sparks that little bit of passion. But like, generally it's like they've tried to take certain ideas and then they've just had to use it in a way to make it into an interesting film, which like you have to respect when you're making films out of ancient historical kind of topics, because if you did it purely off fact, which again, when it's a society that old, we still debate the facts anyway, it's gonna be a little bit dry, isn't it?
I mean, because that was what I studied in uni, was film, which is why I have a book on Amazon if you want to check it out. No, but I which is why I was really my speciality was writing scripts. I've got hundreds and hundreds of half finished scripts that I'm just going through and finishing now. But the main thing, I wrote, as you can imagine, a lot of historical based films. And the main feedback I would get is these characters are very clean, or they're you need to change. The common one I got was you need to change the language. So one of my favourite scripts I wrote was about the Battle of Cavadonga, and I obviously the Spanish will probably know him as Don Pelejo, and I forget his actual name, but the guy who pretty much founded Asturias and began the Reconquista period. But I changed it, and I had him, instead of being on his own, I gave him a little entourage. Like I sort of semi-based his character off of Robin Hood, and I wrote this script on how he was going to claim the kingdom, and then obviously I made like the Islamic conquest sort of like, obviously they would be the villain because they're incursion on the lands, but all of the things I got was, the language they're using, it's not going to be, it's not very good for audiences. And I was like, but this is how they spoke. And I'd spent hours searching up the mannerisms and the way everyone, and I was like, you need to get rid of all of this because it wouldn't, if you was to try and sell the script, it wouldn't go. And that's why I'm not as angry about like in The Last Kingdom. I loved Last Kingdom. Horrendously inaccurate. Like Æthelflæd, Lady of Ursa, is like my Anglo-Saxon hero. That her character is butchered in favour of Uhtred, which I understand from a storytelling point, but it is infuriating. But I'm less aggressively against it now because I understand from someone who's had that feedback of they were happy with me changing the history to fit the story, like when I made him the Robin Hood type figure and I changed the character. And obviously I forget the guy who led the conquest, who was going to be like the main villain, because my original plan was to have him come in, be this really evil person, then you'd see his humane type, him like having to deal with his superiors, and I was like, all rid of that, you need him to be more villainous. It's really annoying because when you're taught to write these scripts, film and history do clash. They do work very well.
You're battling like inside. You're like,
because I was like, I know this history. I know the guy was like, because they were like in their mind they were the good guys. They were committing jihad and they were like expanding the Umayyad Empire. Right? They were the good guys, and in Don Pelejo's mind, he was the good guy. He was defending his land, and it's really hard to translate that to screen and actually then sell your script still, because someone has to be the back, because in film you can't have, I think the best morally grey characters we've had in recent times was like Ultron, like, and even then he's still clearly
that's a really good point actually.
Because he's still portrayed quite clearly as a villain, but his morality is like they tried to do it with Thanos, but again Thanos, it fails. Ultron was much better for me because he in his eyes, he's trying to do the positive thing. And he is correct. You would end war if you got rid of the humans. You're getting rid of the humans. And it's...
Yeah.
But that still has to be portrayed as a villainous thing. We don't get that in-depth... I would love a 3-hour film with an hour monologue of just Ultron explaining why that's a good thing to do. But you can't do that in a film.
Can't do it, no.
You've got an hour and a half. Sorry, I've gone on another tangent. I knew it was going to happen.
But that's what I always talk about with, like, when I start my videos, when I'm talking about any of these, like, ancient historical style films, is that you can't make it completely accurate. So I'm not going to sit here and just critique it and be like, well, they should have done it that way, because it's not going to work. Like, they probably have a lot of them, if they're very good, will have like kind of Easter eggs, or they take inspiration. So you know they've done their research, but they're obviously just limited. Others are just straight up like bad. Like I think Gods of Egypt was the worst one I ever watched and reviewed. It was so bad. I was struggling to say anything about it. I was like, it's just wrong.
With my very limited knowledge of Egyptian mythology and theology, I was sitting there and I was like, this is not. I was like, why is Jaime Lannister running around in ancient Egypt?
It's so bad. It's so bad. Yeah, I just don't know. Again, like, Egypt is a really weird one where the films either go like the Gods of Egypt route, where there's just no real inspiration, or they're all about the plagues. Like the amount of plague films with Ramesses, and it's like, have we not done this now?
I think that's because obviously because Egypt was forgotten mostly by Western and European civilizations because of Greece and Rome. They became the epicenter. In fact, there's a really good alternate history theory of if Carthage had risen instead of Rome, the centers of civilization would have been Carthage and Egypt, and all of our culture will be which is a really interesting idea. And it was about because obviously Carthage probably would have expanded into Egypt the same way Rome expanded into Greece. So it's a really interesting idea, sort of train of thought. And I've completely lost
in the
where I was going.
multiverse. It's there somewhere.
Oh yeah. There is a version of history where Carthage rose and Rome didn't, which is the most interesting idea. I was going somewhere with this, and I've completely forgotten my point. But that was it. No, that was it. But that obviously our history led us to sidelining Egypt for like if you look at any history books written in like medieval England, they're going to reference the Romans, they're going to reference the ancient Greeks, and then you might get a muttering of something that happened in Egypt, which would be post-Ptolemaic. It would be something to do with the Ptolemaic dynasty. Yeah. And then you get the Victorians come along, and all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, we need to get all of this stuff. This is amazing. We need to talk about it. But by that time, everything was connected biblical. And I think that's why everything we talk about is the plagues, because obviously the Bible focused heavily on the plagues and the locusts and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's probably why most of our films...
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
There's so much more to talk about.
That's the same with any like period of history. Like if I was to look at like old like pre-Norman conquest England, the first thing anyone's going to say is, "Oh yeah, Alfred the Great." I'm like, that's good, but even that tiny period of history, you've got Ragnar Lodbrok, possibly, he may or may not have been real. You've got Æthelflæd, you've got Edward the Elder, but every single show and film will go, Alfred the Great, look at this tiny little bit, wasn't he a great guy? Get it? Yeah. It's funny.
And it's quite interesting because specifically with like Egypt compared to Greece and Rome, one of the major themes right now in academia is this idea of like post-colonial study. So basically, let's not be racist with our approach to writing histories. And you see just how much there was, where it's because Egypt is associated with these animal gods, like, oh my God, they worshipped animals, like that's such a backwards way of thinking. They were so much more inferior, like cognitively, to Greece and Rome, because Greece and Rome instead were like, oh, kind of more humanoid gods. Yeah. And it's just amazing how much like just that one bit of prejudice can then affect the whole way it's recorded, and its general lack of people taking interest. Or they look at it instead in like a spectacle perspective.
Yeah, I think the only like obviously recently, because now the modern thing now, obviously the fad of Rome and Greece has passed, and the fad of Egypt is sort of it's phasing out, and now everyone's into sort of like the Indus Valley, Indus Valley, and the other one everyone's obsessed with that I'm speaking to at the moment. Like everyone goes Göbekli Tepe. That's the one. Yeah. It's so hard to get. It's a real tongue twister of a word, that one. But it's interesting how we're looking at those now, whereas if it was discovered if we was looking at it like 100, even 100 years ago, it would have been immediately compared to Rome and Greece, even though these civilizations were thousands of years earlier. Like Göbekli Tepe is, I think it's like 6,000 years old. We still have absolutely no idea really. We know it was a religious center, But apart from that, like, there's accommodation there and we still don't know. But it's interesting how now we look at it through an entirely different lens. Like, there was that period of time, if you was like any of the leading powers, like Imperial Japan, the British Empire, the French Empire, even the Russian Empire, if you was in one of those regions, you was looking at it through a sort of a haughty stature. And it's interesting how, I mean, obviously the Americans still did. I'm joking, all of my American viewers. But it's interesting now how we look at, especially the Indus Valley civilization, because it was one of the founding centers of human civilization.
Exactly, yeah. No, yeah, Indus Valley it's obviously one of the most amazing things, because we generally think at that point in time that this is where culture starts to flourish, is because they have access to all of the things that are going to keep you alive. So naturally, you have an advantage across other regions where there are deserts or swamp and marshes.
Yeah.
So yeah, we see it blossoming out from this very agricultural area. And then once you have this foundation is when you go through the periods where you get little villages. And then within the villages, you start to see how we have social stratification. So we see that in burials where suddenly you're like, okay, we've got a little pit burial for somebody here, but then we've got a large burial with loads of goods here. And we start to see, okay, we're having a hierarchy within our society. And then we start to see them expand out. And it's really interesting. But then what is even more interesting is that it's not this linear progression for any of them. Is you see these moments where it suddenly goes back to almost zero, where they're back to just like this tiny village society with no social stratification.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because I think we always go at it from this perspective of getting from A to B to C with what could be called progression. Obviously, that's a very like Western-centric view that something moving towards our society today is progression.
Yeah.
But again, that's another way where our perception affects it. I've got onto a very like sidetrack thought there.
That's fine. This entire with the first episode that came out a couple of weeks ago now was literally, we were meant to be talking about the Soviet Union the whole time, and then by the end of it we was talking about how dragons are different through various cultures in history. Which how we got there I couldn't recap. But that's this podcast, I love the idea of like, I have such rough ideas. Because we're rounding up to an hour, obviously I don't want to steal all of your evening away, and obviously we've still got to do bits for your channel as well. So we will round up with the last two bits. So Cleopatra, who was Cleopatra the Sixth, I believe. Everyone just calls her Cleopatra. Isn't she not one of history's most underrated rulers? Because she did, a lot of people forget, like the building, like rework she did, and how she actually renovated Egypt, and she's mainly just known for sleeping with Julius Caesar.
Yes, so I love Cleopatra. She's a role model, for want of a better term, for somebody that's like that. I think she is so underrated. And again, it's such a reflection of the fact that when we're writing these kinds of classics history books, it was very much white, middle-aged men of a certain class. So they look at her in a very different way to how we might today. No offense to our white, middle-aged men in any way, but because the thing is, even if we look at her with the deeds of, okay, well, she slept with Julius Caesar, she slept with Mark Antony, it's a political move.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a very powerful political move. She's using resources that she has to gain power, and she does it quite well. Like, obviously we know how it ends, but if it was a guy doing it, would we have just gone, oh well, it's the consort of Julius Caesar? No, you wouldn't. You would respect him exactly for what he's doing, because he's using what he's got. He's using political tactics. So she obviously sees that at this point in time, there's good moments and bad moments within Egypt in that time. And she is very aware that Rome is the growing power. That is who you want to align yourself with. How do you align yourself with it? Find the most powerful man at the time and use that. And then how else do you solidify that? Okay, well, we have children. We try and make sure that everybody knows that we have the child of Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I hate the fact that so many people look at it purely just, okay, well, she got with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Because, again, she's a very clever woman. Like, I think it was, I want to say it's 8 languages that she knew fluently.
I know she knew a lot of different languages. I think I think another portion of why we view Cleopatra that way is obviously the way history was written at the time when we was really researching it. But of course it goes again to historical propaganda is one of my favourite things to look at, because Rome did a hit. Cleopatra would have got away with, like, she would have probably come out on top and probably would have ended up like controlling Egypt under Roman rule. The way she messed up was, like, for lack of a better term, getting into bed with Mark Antony. Because Augustus came in and was like, yeah, no, I'm not really up for Mark Antony having the empire that was quite literally promised to me. So, and that obviously he then went out and said, propaganda. What is Cleopatra famous for? If you have her looking as a competent leader, people might flock to her banner. So he had to make a fool of Mark Antony, which he did on the battlefield. Mark Antony was way in over his head, and he should have accepted that he was a good right hand man. He wasn't Kaiser's replacement sort of thing. I've just noticed the timer going again, so we're gonna have to do another cut out. Stupid Zoom.
That's okay.
To be fair, this will be a good cut off point, and then we'll move over for your channel. So, I've lost my train of thought now. But yeah, no. So he could ridicule Mark Antony on the battlefield. The place he couldn't ridicule Cleopatra was on the battlefield, because she was smarter than that. And so the only way you can do that is by looking at promiscuity. It's a similar way that Catherine the Great was rallied against. There's a lot of things to be mad at Catherine the Great for, like, i.e. unaliving 20,000 Polish people. That's probably a big one to be mad for. But her promiscuity was really weaponized against her by her adversities. The same way that the Pope, I mean, obviously historically is targeted more towards women. But if you look at Henry VIII, the way he had multiple, obviously, beheading 2 of them probably didn't look good. But that is weaponized against him by all of his enemies at the time. It's like, oh, why can't he have children? Because that's the opposite way. So the sexism goes the other way when why isn't Henry having any male heirs? And it's an interesting way of how promiscuity and sexuality throughout history is used as weaponized propaganda by either, obviously, the church against Henry, most of Europe against Catherine, and then by Augustus against Cleopatra, which was then a prejudice that we carried on through modern times for her story. And I think it's an odd thing for everyone to focus on, but it is the most prominent form of propaganda.
Well, it's generally a theme as well with the Roman accounts towards Egypt for a long time after this point, where we get this idea of it being associated purely with femininity and the corruption of luxury, whereas Rome's meant to be very stoic, and they create this contrast. And it very much, there was a little bit before here, but it is exacerbated by his portrayal of Cleopatra to the rest of Rome.
Yeah.
But I think, again, choosing Mark Antony obviously turned out to be the wrong idea, but I feel like if you put yourself in her shoes at that point in time, you could see why she would think he were the right option.
Yes.
Because Augustus or Octavian is so young at that point in time. There's no history to look at him and go, okay, well, he's going to be a very powerful leader. And also, if we probably look at it honestly, like, Augustus wouldn't have been Augustus without Agrippa. So it's very hard to predict just how well he was going to do, because in theory, Mark Antony, he had the rich land of Egypt out of that deal. He should have done quite well.
Yeah, it was just pure historical takeaways that Augustus was the better military commander, and that is where it comes down to. He was better at mobilizing and unifying. Nearly every major battle in history comes down to how can you mobilize the populace, and if you can mobilise the populace behind you, it doesn't normally, like, obviously there is quite a few occasions when that hasn't been the case, i.e. Peter the Hermit and the Peasants' Crusade. I think it was the Peasants' Crusade, which obviously ended horrifically, and as normally goes throughout history, very, very badly for the Jewish populations, especially in Germany when they went through and they decided, oh yeah, we'll just ransack these cities. Obviously, that's a very bad example, and I probably should have brought it up for an example of mobilising the populace. But for the most part, if you get into a position of power and you can mobilise populace, thinking about it, like Napoleon, the reason he came back into power, and I know I diss Napoleon all the time, but credit where credit's due, he mobilised the population. That's how he got into power again, even though he had made France become ravaged by war. And then he's like, as he walked back from after he escaped Elba, St. Helena was the last one. It was like the troops sent to arrest him were like, nah, I'm good. And it's that ability that won Augustus the war, because Mark Antony didn't have that ability. His entire army was like, oh, are we fighting for Mark Antony or are we fighting for Cleopatra? And because Cleopatra, one, wasn't Roman, and two, was a woman, which when she, like, there's an amazing account when she turns up to the Roman court and tells Julius Caesar that she's pregnant. All the Romans are like, what is she doing? Why is he letting her in here? And that obviously, I think that partially was one of the we'll probably go into a bit more of it on your channel, because I've just seen the timer on the meeting is really low now. But I think that was one of the solidifying things that went against Kaiser, because they probably saw that he was letting her take too much control of him. And I think the same thing happened with Mark Antony, and that is why his troops just crumbled. It was a naval battle that he actually lost that crumbled him. But I will do the outro quick because I've seen the timer. So I'm not
carried away.
Thank you for joining me. I think we've done combined the two bits of footage together about an hour or so for the podcast. Even though I'm not sure if it's a chat show or a podcast yet. But anyways, do you want to quickly drop all your socials and I'll link them in the description?
Yes, so go check out my YouTube if you want to carry on this discussion, and then also check me out on TikTok for Bitesized Ancient History, and Instagram and Twitter. I think those are the ones I have.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll drop them all in the links. If you send me the links, I'll put them all in the description. But yeah, thank you for joining me. And if you want to continue a conversation, obviously hop over to Bitesized Ancient History, and we'll see you there. All right, bye guys.